Please comment where you are listening from in the world. Now enjoy 1 hour of home alone on a rainy night horror story. Story 1. We live in a remote farmhouse, far from the hum of nearby towns or the comforting glow of neighbors' porch lights. For miles around, it's just us, the fields, and the thick woods that seem to stretch endlessly into the horizon. In the summer, the isolation feels peaceful, almost idyllic. The days are long, filled with the sound of cicadas and the scent of warm grass. But the nights, especially when it's too hot to sleep, can feel different. Unsettling, even. This story takes place on one of those nights. It was mid-July, and the upstairs of our old farmhouse had become a heat trap. We didn't have air conditioning there, so we relied on open windows and the occasional breeze. My bedroom window faced the back of the house, directly overlooking the sliding glass door that led to our deck. It wasn't much of a view, just the creaky wood planks of the deck and the faint outline of the fields beyond, hidden in the darkness. Normally, it was a quiet, uneventful spot. That night, though, was anything but normal. It was around 1 a.m., and I was struggling to fall asleep. The air was thick and still, clinging to my skin like a damp blanket. The only sounds were the faint chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then the dogs started barking. We've always had dogs, a pair of loyal mutts who act as both family and sentinels. Their barking wasn't unusual. Living out here, they'd often bark at raccoons, deer, or the occasional coyote that wandered too close. But something about the way they barked that night was different. It wasn't frenzied or aggressive. It was sharp, quick, and then silence. Too much silence. Normally, when they barked at wildlife, they'd keep going for a while, chasing off whatever intruder had dared to trespass on their territory. But this time, they stopped almost immediately. That's what made me uneasy. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, my heart already thudding in my chest. And that's when I heard it, the faintest knocking sound. It was so soft, so deliberate, that for a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again. A quiet, almost polite knock, like someone gently testing their presence without wanting to make too much noise. My body went rigid. The heat of the night suddenly felt suffocating, as if the air had been pressed out of the room. I didn't move. I couldn't. Something about that sound filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. I knew I had to look. I had to know what, or who was outside. But every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay still, to stay hidden. The knocking came again, just as faint, just as deliberate. Summoning every shred of courage I had, I crept to the window and peered down. Standing on the deck, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, was a man. He was tall, much taller than my dad, and broad-shouldered, with a frame that looked like it belonged to someone who worked with his hands. He was wearing a trench coat, of all things. A heavy, dark trench coat in the middle of a sweltering summer night. That alone was enough to set every alarm bell in my head ringing. But it wasn't just his appearance that unnerved me. It was the way he was knocking. He wasn't using his hand. He was holding something, a long, dark object, and tapping it against the glass. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't tell what the object was, but I knew it wasn't good. I backed away from the window as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. I needed to wake my parents. My mom's room was closer, so I went to her first. Shaking her awake, I whispered, "Mom, there's someone outside." She blinked at me groggily, trying to process what I was saying. I didn't wait for her to fully wake up. I left her room and headed to my dad's, my pulse quickening with every step. Waking him was harder. He's a deep sleeper, and I didn't want to raise my voice and risk alerting the man on the deck. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stirred. I told him what I saw, and his expression shifted from confusion to grim determination. My dad's room was also near the deck, and he went to the window to see for himself. I stayed back, barely daring to breathe. When he looked down, his jaw tightened. The man was still there, but now he was jiggling the handle of the sliding door. He was trying to get in. Dad didn't say a word. He turned and grabbed something, a heavy wooden bat he kept by the bed for emergencies. By then, my mom had joined us, her face pale but resolute. Together, the three of us made our way downstairs. The stairs creaked under our weight, and I winced at every sound. I felt like we were walking into a trap, like the man could sense us coming. When we reached the bottom, my dad gestured for us to stay back. He approached the sliding door cautiously, the bat gripped tightly in his hand. The man on the other side saw him and froze. For a moment, no one moved. The man stared at my dad, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he stepped back, his hands still clutching whatever he'd been using to knock. Up close, I could see him more clearly. His face was rough, weathered, and his eyes darted nervously between my dad and the bat in his hands. He looked confused, almost like he hadn't expected anyone to confront him. My dad didn't waste any time. "What do you want?" he barked, his voice steady and commanding. "Why are you here?" The man hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. My dad didn't give him a chance to answer. "I've got a weapon, and the police are on their way," he said. "You better tell me what you're doing here." The man stammered, his words tumbling out in a slurred, almost incoherent mess. I'm drunk," he said finally. "I got lost. I need a ride home." Even in my terror, I could tell he was lying. My dad saw through it immediately. He narrowed his eyes, his grip on the bat tightening. "I call bull crap," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Who wears a trench coat in the middle of summer while they're drunk?" It was such a simple question, but it cut through the man's excuse like a knife. His face twisted, and for a moment, I thought he might try to force his way in. But then, in the distance, the faint wail of a siren broke the silence. The police were coming. The man's head snapped toward the sound, and without another word, he turned and bolted into the fields, disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived minutes later, their flashing lights cutting through the night. We told them everything, and they searched the area, but the man was long gone. What they did find, though, was chilling. Lying near the deck, partially hidden in the grass, was a machete. It was long and sharp, its blade glinting ominously under the beam of a flashlight. Story 2. I lived with my parents and my 2 daughters. We lived in a nice house in the countryside that MY Pops had finally had enough of the small-town crimes and decided to move us back to the countryside, that he wants the girls to have space to run around and give them their own treehouse. He also had brought us 4 dogs and making sure that the yard is fenced all around so no creatures doesn't walk in or out of our yard while keeping the kids safe. My kids' father had came to get the girls this weekend as my pops, and my mom went to town for his health since he gotten sick. The dogs were keeping me company as I enjoy being home alone during the day, that IT just feels the same either my parents and my daughters are here, or not as long as I had enjoyed the weekend, that I didn't have work at the time, and I was getting my sleep in as usual. The kids just call my phone just to chat with me, and asking about the dogs more than me that I don't mind about them asking about the dogs as long as I'm able to hear from them. I went to sleep around 11 p.m., right after I finished the anime series. All of the doors and windows were locked. The dogs were inside the house either doing their thing or sleeping, that I was sleeping good until I heard a bark going on downstairs, that I had one of the dogs with me upstairs lifting her head up to hear the other dog barking, that I had grabbed my kanata over the stand, and went downstairs with the DOG, that yes, I was creeping downstairs. The other 2 dogs started to bark that my hand had gripped the kanata as. I walked slowly. My foot had touched the floor, and walked towards my dogs that I stand behind them, and noticed that the doorknob was twisting left, and right at first it doesn't look like something was on the other side until I see something tall over the back door window. The curtains were preventing whatever it was looking through the windows, but it looks completely off. The dogs had stopped barking for a moment and standing their ground to protect me. The fur on their necks were high as their teeth were showing. My eyes looked at the clock on the wall and sees that it's 3 a.m. Then my eyes looked to the figure outside of my back door, that I had my phone in my robe pocket to check the cameras. Good thing that my brothers had installed the cameras around the house along with the ring on both front and back doors, that I backed myself to the stairs to take a seat. One of the dogs had moved to sit behind me and watched upstairs, that I had unlocked my phone to get on Ring to see who or what is clearly out there. My phone screen was showing something tall, black and skinny figure trying to get into the house, that IT was wearing some hat that was covering its face. The arms were thin and long, but the fingers were even longer than the whole arm itself. The way its fingers were bending looked disgusting. Not the same way a human's hand bend. The midsection was moving like a video game character, but the way it inhales freaks me out. The midsection was sucked like a straw. When it exhales, the body looks like the tree. Trunk. The legs were deformed so badly that it looks impossible to stand, run, jump, or anything that a human could do. Then, I heard the thing speaking in my oldest's voice. "Mama, can you let me and Lele in?" I stayed silent as I started to record the thing talking, that my hands were a bit shaky when I started to record. The thing starts speaking again with my oldest's voice. "Mama, Daddy is outside waiting for you to open the door." Nothing that I stayed silent again as I watched in horror. The thing switched over to my youngest's voice. "Mommy, I am so sleepy. Please let us in so Daddy could go back to his car." Not one sound had came out of my voice that I could hear myself screaming in fear in my mind. The thing continued talking in my youngest voice. "Mommy, please let us in. We're so sleepy. Please let us in now." The thing had switched over to my pop's voice. "Lit bit, let us in right now. You can't let us stay outside all night without anything happening to us." My lower jaw had dropped as it sounds like my pop's. The thing keeps talking in my pop's voice. "Why aren't you up to open up the door for us? Please let us inside of our home." The thing switched over to my mom's voice. "Baby girl, please don't ignore us forever, and let us in. We're at the door waiting for you to open it." My body had chills around as my heart drops to my stomach. The thing speaks in my mom's voice. "Come on now, let us inside of our home. We are so tired that we need to get in bed." I had shaken my head no as tears were released slowly down on my cheeks. Then, the thing had switched over to my kid's father's voice. "It's your parents and our kids at the door. I'm here with them as well. They say they are tired and need some sleep now." The thing started to scream so loudly that the dogs were trying their best not to bark at the screaming. The screaming was like a bloody murder scream as it continues on for hours, using everyone else's voice combined, saying different things, that I was so scared to move from my spot as it screams more loudly that I wasn't sure how long it was screaming until 5 a.m. had reached the clock. The whole household went quiet. The thing finally decides to leave the doorsteps and leaped over the fence that I watched it, walking away with its disgusting legs. That I went back to my room and lay still in bed. The 3 dogs were sleeping on the floor of my room, while the other stays awake to make sure I'm okay. That I had went back to sleep when I feel safe enough to get some sleep at 7 a.m. My parents had made it home by 9 a.m., and they were happy to be home. That my pops had went over to my room to check up on me, and noticed how tired I was when he came in. "You must have seen that video too?" he asked. That my mind was blank for a minute, until he shows me the footage of what happened at 3 and my body had run cold all over again as he realized that I watching the same thing. "I don't know what it is, but I am so glad that you didn't respond or open the door." My pops said, "Yeah, I was glad that I didn't do it at all. That it was strange that it was copying your voice, mom's voice, the kid's voice, and my kid's father's voice in that video." I said, "If I had ever opened or respond to that last night, the dogs and I would have been torn into parts and everything will be a bloody mess. The kids and my ex would have been in danger if that thing pretends to be me while hiding in the house. Same thing for my parents. If I ever opened that door, I would be the first one dead." Story 3. One of the scariest experiences of my life happened during one of the first times I was left home alone as a teenager. It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful Sunday. My parents had taken my younger brother to some event. I don't even remember what it was now. And for the first time, I had the house all to myself. At first, I was thrilled. The freedom of being alone felt almost intoxicating. No one to nag me about chores, no little brother to annoy me. Just me, the empty house, and a lazy day ahead. I had big plans: watch TV, eat snacks my mom didn't usually let me have, and maybe even blast some music. Typical teenager stuff. For the first couple of hours, everything was going great. I lounged around, scrolling through my phone, flipping through channels, and enjoying the kind of peace and quiet you only get when you're completely alone. But of course, being a teenager, I got restless. The novelty of having the house to myself wore off faster than I expected. So against my parents' explicit instructions, I decided to leave. I figured it wouldn't be a big deal, just a quick trip to a friend's house down the street. What could go wrong, right? In my rush to leave, I didn't even think to lock the door behind me. Honestly, I didn't even realize I'd forgotten until much later, when it was already too late. I hung out at my friend's house for a few hours, completely oblivious to what I'd left behind. We played video games, ate junk food, and laughed about stupid stuff like we always did. I felt free, rebellious even, for sneaking out without permission. But that carefree feeling evaporated the second I stepped back into my house. From the moment I walked through the door, I knew something was off. It was one of those gut feelings you can't really explain, but it hits you like a ton of bricks. The air felt different, heavier somehow, and the house was eerily silent. Too silent. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was just being paranoid because I knew I'd broken the rules. But then I started noticing little things that didn't add up. The first thing I saw was the kitchen. The cabinets were open, and not just one or two, nearly all of them. It was like someone had been rummaging through them, looking for something. Some of the drawers were slightly pulled out, too, and a few random items were scattered across the counter. My stomach sank. I knew I hadn't left the kitchen like that. I always cleaned up after myself when I made snacks because I didn't want my mom lecturing me later. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd just forgotten. Maybe I'd been in too much of a hurry when I left the house. Maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting. I told myself to calm down. But then, as I moved through the house, I noticed more things out of place. A chair in the living room was pushed back at an odd angle, like someone had been sitting there. A lamp on the end table was slightly tilted, as if it had been bumped. Little things, but enough to make my pulse start racing. I stood in the middle of the living room, my heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to run out the door and never look back, but another part of me, the part that didn't want to feel like a total scaredy cat, decided to investigate. I figured maybe I was just being paranoid, letting my imagination get the better of me. So I did the dumbest thing I could have done. I started shouting, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice sounded shaky, even to me. I waited, straining to hear any kind of response. Nothing. The house was still as a tomb. I tried again, louder this time. "If someone's here, you better come out now." Still nothing. The silence should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. It felt wrong, unnatural, like the house was holding its breath. After a few tense moments, I started to relax. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I mean, if someone had broken in, wouldn't they have made some kind of noise by now? I was starting to convince myself that everything was fine when my phone rang. The sudden sound made me jump about a foot in the air. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and looked at the screen. Unknown caller. My stomach twisted into knots. I don't usually answer calls from unknown numbers, but something compelled me to pick up. Maybe I thought it was my parents, calling from someone else's phone. Or maybe I just wanted to hear a friendly voice. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. At first, there was nothing. Just silence. And then I heard it, deep, ragged breathing. The kind of breathing that sends chills down your spine. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. Just more breathing. "Seriously, who is this? This isn't funny." Still nothing. Then the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my hands trembling. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank call, maybe one of my friends messing with me. But before I could even process what had just happened, my phone rang again. Unknown caller. My stomach dropped. Against my better judgment, I answered. The breathing was back, heavier this time, almost angry. "Who the hell is this?" I demanded, my fear quickly morphing into frustration. "If you don't say something, I'm hanging up." There was a long pause, and then, in a voice so low and so quiet I almost didn't hear it, the caller whispered, "I'm in the house." My blood ran cold. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. It felt like time had stopped. Every hair on my body stood on end. I wanted to believe it was a joke, some sick prank, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I knew it was real. Acting on pure adrenaline, I tried to sound tough. "Very funny," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "You're not scaring me." I hung up, hoping that would be the end of it. But then I heard it, creaking floorboards. From upstairs. I froze, my mind racing. It felt like my worst nightmare come to life. The creaking turned into slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was up there. Someone was in my house. Before I could even think of what to do, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. And then all at once, they started again, faster this time. Louder. Whoever it was, they were running down the stairs. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. As I reached the front door, I heard something crash behind me. I didn't stop to look. I threw the door open and sprinted outside, heading straight for the woods behind our house. I didn't even think about grabbing my phone. I just ran as fast as I could, the branches and leaves tearing at my skin. Once I was deep enough into the woods, I finally stopped and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to dial 911. The operator's voice was calm and reassuring, but I could barely get the words out. "Someone's in my house," I stammered. "They're in my house." The cops arrived quickly, quicker than I expected, considering how far out we lived. I stayed hidden in the woods until I saw their flashing lights. When I finally emerged, they escorted me back to the house. The front door was wide open, just like I'd left it. The officers searched the house from top to bottom, but whoever had been inside was gone. They didn't find anyone, but what they did find was chilling. Several drawers and cabinets had been rifled through, and a few items, random things like a flashlight and a kitchen knife, were missing. The scariest part? They found muddy footprints leading from the back door to the staircase. Footprints that didn't belong to me. To this day, they never found the person who broke in. Story 4. My uncle. 3 gangsters and me. When I was 22, my uncle showed up at my small one-bedroom bungalow. As always, every time any of my 4 uncles showed up, my heart sunk. To say that BV was messed up would have been the understatement of the year. He has always been a dodgy character, but the uncle I have the strongest relationship with out of the 4. Personally for me the best of a bad bunch, and that's scraping the barrel. He, like the other 3, was a criminal at that point and associated with some pretty unsavory people. There was nothing new about that. None of the rest of the family has broken the law. My granda was a long-service soldier and a hard-working family man. Likewise, Gran gave birth to 9 babies, and in between those times had very responsible jobs in London. Their 5 daughters, although not having easy lives, and having their own personal troubles and tragedies, have all managed to grow up in the same house without breaking the law in any way, all supporting themselves, and their children by maintaining, again, very good, responsible jobs whilst raising us, their children, to all, in one way or another, be high achievers and really good people with strong moral compasses. Back to BV. He had obviously been up to no good, as he was paranoid, jittery, and on edge. He was also using in a big way. I called my mom and she came around. I told BV he could stay the weekend, with 2 conditions. No stolen goods and no drugs. He agreed a little reluctantly and settled down. Mum decided to stay too in case it went pear-shaped. It did. The next day was Friday and my day off work. BV went out early. It was a lazy day. I was just doing a bit of tidying up. I was cleaning around a massive pot plant, and stuffed down inside it I found a huge bag of suspect-looking white powder, which didn't look for personal use, various nasty-looking weapons, and several nice-looking pieces of jewelry. I was very narked off, to say the least, but after showing Mum I left the dubious stuff where it was, as I needed time to think about what I should do. When BV got back from wherever it was he went, I asked about the items. He lied as usual, saying that he had down a job, legal of course, for an old friend, and that was his payment. I told him straight out I didn't believe a word he had told me, and that I wanted him and his stuff out first thing in the morning. The next day Mum and I got up and noticed BV was gone. I looked for the stuff and saw it was still there. Mum had to work that morning. She told me she'd be straight home after, and I settled down for a quiet, chilled morning. Around 11 o'clock a.m., there was a loud knock on the door, followed by someone having fun with the buzzer. As I use a wheelchair, it takes me a bit of time to get to my front door if I'm alone, so I was getting more and more annoyed by the incessant commotion. On opening the door, I came face to face with the 3 of the meanest, nastiest, and skankiest men I have ever seen. They all looked straight ahead, and because I was at a lower level their eyes went down to meet mine. To be fair, they all seemed surprised by my appearance. I was very small and skinny and looked more like 14 than 22. They all looked at each other in utter shock before I said, "Hello, can I help you?" The middle gangster, the nastiest looking one, said, "We're looking BV, sweetheart. Is he around?" One of the others said he was staying with a girl, my name. I was bricking inside, but the sheer audacity of my uncle made anger took over my fear and made me braver. I said, "No, he's not around, he's gone, he won't be back, and that's me. I'm his niece." The 3 thugs looked really uncomfortable and shuffled looking at each other. I said, "Well, he has something of ours. Do you know where it could be?" The middle mean one asked. "Yeah, I'll get it for you. Wait there." I told the 3 of them and shut the door on them. As I did, I heard one of them saying, "That's low even for BV. You see her? She's a kid in a wheelchair." When I got back with their belongings, I shoved it at the meanest one and said, "When you do see BV again, tell him from me if he even thinks about coming here again, I'll call the police, and that goes for you too." The mean one said, "He had our stuff. We had to get it back." I said, still blagging, "That's fine. I'm just saying what I will do." The 3 thugs nodded and left hurriedly. After they left, I was shaking all over. I was really scared and upset. When Mum got home, I told her about the incident. She went ape. I know that at a later date she saw her brother and threatened him with something nasty if he ever came near me or bought his criminal scumbag mates around me again, and to give his due, he never has. Another story to add from a friend of mine. Mine was kind of scary. This was in 2021 when my mom left my dad, and she took 5 of us, and my older sister lived on the other side of town. My mom had to go to the store for snacks because she was going to work late the next day. My siblings wanted to go, but I didn't want to, just wanted to watch TV. We just moved into our new apartment, so my mom did not have her computer out to play games. My mom never lets me stay home alone, but that day she let me, so they soon left leaving me alone. It was around 9:18, and I was just chilling watching TV. We did have 2 dogs and a cat, but they were still with my dad. We needed permission to have them. I was just chilling watching Full House when all of a sudden I heard a creak upstairs. The floors make a sound when a weight of a human walks on it. I was scared but not scared at the same time. But I brushed it off thinking that it was the neighbors next door. We sometimes easily hear. I kept watching. Just like 15 seconds later, I heard it again, but it was in my older brother's room. Okay, this time, I actually got goosebumps, so I grabbed the biggest knife we had and tried to head upstairs, but something told me not to, so I somehow didn't. A few minutes later they came back. I told my mom about it, but she told it was just my imagination. Of course, as a little kid, my little sister believed me. She decided to check upstairs. She is more braver than me even though she was only 8. Damn, I am AP asterisk 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 asterisk. She checked, but she found nothing. I checked my older brother's room. I found bag of chips, but we swear on our mother that we don't eat upstairs. A few months passed. I was walking home from my dancing club, and I saw there was a break-in, and it was near my apartment. I'm now 13, and this happened when I was 11, and I still remember it. Story 5. When I was a kid, I stayed the night at a friend's house. It wasn't my first time going over there. We hung out a lot back then, but it was the first time I ever stayed the night. I remember being excited about it too. There was something about sleepovers when you're a kid that just felt like the ultimate adventure. His parents were nice enough, though a little rough around the edges. His mom was a heavy smoker, and his dad had a fondness for beer that bordered on excessive. But hey, it wasn't my house, and none of that mattered much to me. They were good people, and my friend and I always had a great time together. That night, it was me, my friend, and another one of our buddies. We stayed up late doing all the typical kid stuff, eating junk food, chugging soda, and playing GoldenEye 007 on his N64. We were glued to the screen for hours, yelling and laughing like kids do when they don't have a care in the world. I remember looking at the clock at one point and seeing it was past 2 a.m., but none of us wanted to stop. Eventually, though, the sugar crash hit us hard, and we decided it was time to call it a night. We all sprawled out on the floor of the basement, sleeping bags and pillows scattered everywhere. It was one of those warm summer nights where the air felt heavy, but the basement was cool, almost chilly. The kind of place that felt safe, like nothing bad could happen because you were surrounded by friends. At least, that's what I thought. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up. It was the middle of the night, and everything was silent except for the faint hum of the basement refrigerator. Then I heard it, a crash loud and sharp like glass breaking. It sounded like it had come from upstairs. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and looked around. My friends were still out cold, snoring softly, completely oblivious to the noise. I tried shaking them awake, whispering their names, but they didn't even stir. I thought about just lying back down and pretending I hadn't heard anything, but curiosity got the better of me. Or maybe it was something else. Something I can't explain. Whatever it was, I found myself creeping up the basement stairs, one slow step at a time, my breath catching in my throat. The house was dark, the kind of pitch black where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I felt my way up the stairs, my fingers brushing the wall for balance. When I reached the top step, I froze. The dining room was just ahead, dimly lit by the street light outside filtering through the curtains. Something had fallen on the table, something big. It looked like a cabinet or maybe a shelf, but I couldn't quite make it out in the dark. I took a step closer, squinting to get a better look, and that's when I saw them. There were 2 figures in the room. One of them was my friend's dad, slumped over the table, his head pinned beneath whatever had fallen. He wasn't moving. The other figure, it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It was tall, impossibly thin, and barely more than a shadow. Its outline was jagged, like it didn't belong in this world. I couldn't make out a face, just a void where its head should have been. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Then the thing turned its head, or whatever it had for a head, in my direction. It let out a sound that I can only describe as a screech, high-pitched and guttural, like nails on a chalkboard mixed with the roar of an animal. The walls around me trembled with the force of it, and I swore I could feel the ground shaking beneath my feet. In that moment, I don't know what came over me, but I screamed back. Go away! My voice cracked with fear, but I yelled it as loud as I could. The thing didn't hesitate. It lunged at me, faster than anything I'd ever seen. Before I even had time to react, I felt something shove me hard. It was like being hit by a truck. I flew backward, crashing through what felt like walls and floors, until I landed with a thud in complete darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the cold, hard floor of the basement. My body ached all over, but there wasn't a scratch on me. I looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My friends were still there, still asleep in their sleeping bags, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it had to be a dream, a vivid, awful nightmare. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, my body trembling, and forced myself to close my eyes. Somehow, I drifted off again. When I woke up the next morning, everything felt wrong. My skin was itchy, like I'd been rolling around in insulation or something, and the basement was stiflingly hot. It was summer, sure, but it felt like I was sitting in an oven. I looked around and realized, with a sinking feeling, that nothing looked the same. The basement wasn't the basement anymore. It was a dim, unfamiliar space, cluttered with boxes and old furniture. My friends were gone. Panic set in. I jumped out of my sleeping bag and started yelling for my friends' parents, for anyone. There was no response. The house was completely silent. I stumbled through the unfamiliar space, tears streaming down my face, calling out for help. Hours seemed to pass as I wandered aimlessly, my voice growing hoarse from screaming. Then I heard it, voices, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere below me. They were calling my name. At first, I couldn't tell who it was, so I stayed silent, too scared to respond. But then I heard my mom's voice. She was crying, praying for me to come home. The sound of her voice broke something in me, and I yelled back, "Mom, I'm here. I'm here." She went quiet, so suddenly it startled me. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard her screaming for my dad. I kept yelling, pounding on the walls, trying to let them know where I was. Finally, I heard footsteps, frantic and heavy, and then the sound of wood splintering. Moments later, my dad's face appeared, his eyes wide with relief and terror. He pulled me into his arms, and I clung to him, sobbing. When they got me out, I realized I was in the attic. Not the basement, the attic. And here's the thing, there was no way for me to have gotten there. The house didn't have a pull-down ladder or any kind of access point. The only way in was through a small window on the side of the house, and you'd need a 20-foot ladder and some serious tools to get there. I was only 10 years old. There was no explanation for how I ended up there. Apparently, I had been missing for 4 days. My friend's parents thought I'd wandered off in the middle of the night, and the entire town had been searching for me. The police, family, neighbors, everyone was convinced I'd been kidnapped. And yet, the whole time, I was right there in the attic. When they brought me to the hospital, the doctors and police were baffled. I wasn't injured, not seriously, but I did have 5 long, parallel scratches down my back. They were too perfectly spaced to be random, almost like claw marks. There were other marks on my arms and legs, too, small cuts and bruises I couldn't explain. And one of my eyes, usually blue, was blood red for nearly a month. The doctors said it was just burst blood vessels, but it felt like something more than that. Despite everything, I didn't show any signs of trauma. I wasn't malnourished or dehydrated, even though I hadn't eaten in 4 days. The psychiatrists couldn't make sense of it, either. They kept asking me questions, trying to get me to explain what had happened, but I didn't have any answers. I still don't. To this day, no one knows what happened to me. My parents don't talk about it, and I've never been back to that friend's house. It's been years now, but I still think about it all the time. About the shadowy figure, the screech, and the way the walls seemed to tremble. About waking up in a place I couldn't have possibly gotten to on my own. I don't know if it was a dream, a hallucination, or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real. It happened, and no one will ever be able to explain it. Story 6. This happened in 2022, sometime in September, if I remember correctly. I was 12 years old and going to school online at the time. Everything about that year was kind of a blur, but this one experience stands out so vividly that I doubt I'll ever forget it. It was the first time I was home alone without my younger siblings around, and what happened that day still gives me chills when I think about it. My parents had decided to pick up some food that evening, and took both of my younger siblings with them. Normally, they'd bring all of us along, or at least have me babysit the little ones. But since I was in the middle of an online class, they figured I could stay behind on my own. I saw it as an opportunity to prove I was mature enough to handle being home alone. I'd been babysitting my siblings since 2018, so I was used to having some responsibility, but there was still a part of me that felt a little nervous. I'd never been completely alone in the house before, and the idea of it made my stomach twist. Still, I didn't want to seem like a baby, so I agreed. After they left, the house felt quiet, too quiet. I logged out of my class early, something I probably shouldn't have done, but I figured no one would notice. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through TikTok, trying to distract myself and shake off the weird feeling of being alone in an empty house. Time always moves strangely when you're on your phone, and before I knew it, maybe 10 or 20 minutes had passed. That's when I heard it. Someone was calling my name from downstairs. At first, I froze. My heart skipped a beat, but then I thought, oh, my family must be back already. The voice sounded so familiar, so casual, like it belonged to someone I knew well. It sounded like my mom. She was calling my name, just like she always did when she needed my help with something. I felt relieved, brushing off the tension I'd been feeling since they left. "Ha!" I shouted back, loud enough for whoever it was to hear. I figured they must have forgotten their keys, and that's why they were calling for me. It made perfect sense in my head. I got up from my bed, walked toward the front door, and opened it without a second thought. Now, let me explain something about the layout of the house. It wasn't exactly a regular front door situation. We lived in a duplex, so technically the front door wasn't the actual door to the house. It was this weird setup where you had to go down a set of stairs to get to the main door that led outside. I don't know why the house was designed that way, but it was. So when I opened the front door, I was just looking down the staircase that led to the real front door below. I leaned over the railing and yelled, "Did you lose your key?" My voice echoed slightly in the empty stairwell. A moment later, I heard the voice again. "Yeah, open the door," it said. It sounded exactly like my mom. Exactly. There wasn't even a question in my mind at the time. I didn't hesitate. I walked down the stairs, expecting to see her standing there, maybe with bags of food in her hands or my siblings running around her feet. But when I reached the bottom and opened the door, there was nothing. No one. The street outside was completely empty. No car in the driveway, no sign of my family, not even a neighbor walking by. Just silence. My heart sank like a stone. I stood there for a moment, staring out into the empty street, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe they'd driven off to grab something, and were about to come back. Maybe I'd misheard, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The voice I'd heard, it wasn't just similar to my mom's voice. It was her voice. It had the same tone, the same inflection, even the same urgency she always used when she needed me to do something. I slammed the door shut and bolted back up the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I grabbed my phone and immediately called my mom. She picked up after a few rings, and before she could even say hello, I blurted out, "Were you just at the house? Did you forget your keys or something?" Her response made my blood run cold. "No, we're still at the restaurant," she said, sounding confused. "Why?" I hesitated, not sure how to explain what had just happened. Finally, I told her everything. The voice calling my name, the empty doorway, the undeniable fact that it sounded exactly like her. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I thought for a moment that she might be worried, maybe even scared, but instead, she sighed and said something that made my stomach churn. "You probably just let a spirit into the house," she said, her tone more annoyed than concerned. "Why would you open the door without checking first?" I couldn't believe it. That was her reaction? Not fear, not disbelief, not even a hint of concern for the fact that her 12-year-old child had just heard a disembodied voice calling their name. She acted like it was my fault for opening the door, like I'd done something careless and stupid. I felt a lump rise in my throat, equal parts frustration and fear. I wanted to yell at her, tell her that I wasn't making it up, that I wasn't being stupid. But instead I just muttered, "Okay," and hung up. The rest of the time I was home alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't actually alone. Every little sound made me jump, a creak in the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. I stayed in my room with the door locked, my phone clutched tightly in my hand, scrolling through TikTok in a desperate attempt to distract myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about that voice. My mom's voice, or whatever it was. When my family finally came home, I felt a wave of relief, so intense it almost made me cry. I tried to bring it up again, to tell my mom how scared I'd been, but she just brushed it off. "You're fine," she said, waving her hand dismissively. It was probably nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. Even now, thinking back to that day, I get chills. And whatever it was, it knew my name. Story 7. A few weeks ago, I moved into what seemed like an ordinary house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest place in a quiet neighborhood. I was thrilled to finally have my own space, a place to settle down and call my own. But now, I can't shake the feeling that this house has secrets. Secrets that I was never meant to uncover. I think someone is living within the walls of my home. It started small, just little things. The kind of stuff you'd shrug off without giving much thought. At night, I'd hear faint creaks and groans as if the house was settling. It's an older home, so I figured it was normal. Maybe the wind was pushing against the siding, or maybe the wooden beams were expanding and contracting with the temperature. Logical explanations. That's what I kept telling myself. But then the noises started to change. They weren't just random creaks anymore. They became more deliberate, more rhythmic, like footsteps. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like faint knocking, not on the doors, but inside the walls themselves. Late at night, when everything else was silent, I began hearing whispers. They were so quiet, so muffled, that I couldn't make out what was being said. It sounded like a conversation, like multiple voices speaking just beyond the drywall. I told myself it must be my imagination, or maybe even the neighbors, though the houses on either side of me were a good distance away. One night, I woke up to the sound of what I can only describe as shuffling. It was faint, but distinct enough to pull me out of my half-asleep haze. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house, somewhere near the basement. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, straining to hear any other sounds. But after a minute or two, everything went silent again. Still, the unease lingered. That was the first night I locked my bedroom door before going back to sleep. Days passed, and I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread. I told myself I was being paranoid, that moving into a new place always comes with an adjustment period. But the feeling of being watched never went away. You know that sensation when you're alone, but you're absolutely certain someone's eyes are on you? That's how I felt, constantly. It got to the point where I started checking the doors and windows multiple times a day to make sure they were locked. Then came the night I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself, when I heard it again, the whispering. This time, it was louder than before. It wasn't distant or muffled. It was close. Too close. My stomach dropped, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. I don't know what possessed me to investigate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation, that I wasn't losing my mind. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the creaky basement stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The air down there was damp and heavy, and the faint smell of mildew made me want to gag. The basement wasn't anything special, just a concrete floor, exposed pipes, and a few old shelves left by the previous owner. I stood there for a while, shining my flashlight around, listening. At first, there was nothing. Just silence. I was about to go back upstairs when I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic knocking. It was coming from the far wall. I walked over, my hands trembling, and pressed my ear to the wall. The knocking stopped. I tapped on the wall just once, and to my absolute horror, something knocked back. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I noticed it, a section of the wall that didn't look quite right. The paneling was loose, slightly ajar, like it had been pried open recently. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to go back upstairs and forget I ever saw it. But then, against my better judgment, I reached out and pulled the panel aside. Behind it was a narrow, dark passage. The kind you see in horror movies. The kind that leads somewhere no one should ever go. The air inside was stale and had a faint metallic smell like blood or rust. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness as I crouched down and crawled inside. The walls of the passage were rough, unfinished wood, and the floor was covered in dust and debris. I could feel my breathing quicken, each inhale shaky and shallow. The passage led to a small chamber, no bigger than a walk-in closet. The first thing I noticed was the flickering candlelight. Someone had left a candle burning, its wax dripping onto the floor. Next, I saw the makeshift bed, just a pile of old blankets and pillows shoved into the corner. Surrounding it were old, yellowed photographs, tacked to the walls with rusty nails. Some of the photos were so faded that I couldn't make out the faces, but others were clear enough to see that they were of people. strangers, families, couples, children, and then there were the drawings. They were scrawled all over the walls in what looked like charcoal or maybe ash. Some were symbols I didn't recognize, jagged and unsettling, while others were crude sketches of faces. Faces with hollow eyes and twisted, gaping mouths. But the thing that truly made my blood run cold was the writing. Scrawled in shaky, uneven letters were names and dates. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering every inch of the walls. Some of the dates went back decades, but others were recent. Very recent. Like last month. My stomach churned when I realized that many of the names had been crossed out, as if someone was keeping track of something, or someone. I was about to turn back when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the passage behind me. My entire body went rigid as the realization hit me. I wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was coming. Panic set in, and I scrambled back the way I came, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I crawled through the narrow passage. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. I could hear the faint sound of breathing now, low and raspy, like whoever, or whatever it was struggling to contain their excitement. I burst out of the passage and slammed the panel shut behind me, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I didn't wait to see if they would follow. I ran upstairs, locked the basement door, and shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. For the rest of the night, I sat in the corner of my bedroom, clutching a kitchen knife and listening to the whispers that seemed to grow louder and more sinister. Since that night, I haven't gone back into the basement. I can't bring myself to. But the noises haven't stopped. The whispers are constant now, always just on the edge of hearing, like they're taunting me. Sometimes, I'll hear faint tapping on the walls or the sound of something being dragged across the floor. And at night, I swear I can feel eyes on me watching from the shadows. I've thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That my house is haunted? That someone's living in the walls? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I'm starting to think I'm crazy. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I don't know who, or what, is living in my walls, but I'm terrified that they're not content to stay hidden. I don't think I'm safe here. I don't think I ever was. Story 8. When I was a kid, a young teenager, I frequently spent my Saturday nights babysitting my siblings. As the eldest of 3, I assumed this responsibility with no pay nor thanks to speak of. It was simply expected of me, one of my contributions to the family. I babysat so frequently because, my parents needed it. They'd had marriage problems in the past, and their counselor told them they should go on a weekly date. Revive the magic, rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. Yeah, it sucked to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents were happier than they'd been in ages, and they both seemed genuinely excited for date night each week. I would have rather been doing other things, of course, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I desperately wanted my parents to stick together. And so it was that on the night of December 3rd, in the year 2006, I stood at the open front door of my secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway. "Drive safe," I called out, steam pouring from my mouth. I don't know if they heard me or not. Wrapping my arms around my torso in response to the wintry mountain air, I entertained myself for a few brief moments by exhaling forcefully and watching my breath float away into nothing. And there was truly nothing around me, not a car or a creature in sight. It wasn't long before I grew bored and turned back into the warm house, nose tingling from the chill. Georgie and Kate were eating their dinner at the kitchen table. As I watched them, I couldn't help feeling like an only child. Georgie, 3 years my junior, was severely autistic and not talkative. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and only then in the simplest of words. Milk and sandwich was code for peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was presently devouring. Kate, meanwhile, was still a baby just shy of 2. The 9-year gap between them is glaring, but to this day, my parents swear to me Kate wasn't an accident. Kind of like back in high school, when I swore to them I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished dinner, and I set them up with their entertainment for the night. Georgie in his room with the PlayStation 2, which was a hot commodity in those days, and Kate in her crib, in front of Sesame Street. Myself, I ignited the basement fireplace, dimmed the overheads, and curled up with a book by the light of our Christmas tree. God, that was a nice house. Not a day goes by that I don't miss it. I read, in perfect contentment, for nearly an hour. Night had fallen by then, and the room had become toasty. I was beginning to doze off when I heard Georgie's heavy footfalls descending the staircase. I sat upright and looked at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, brow furrowed in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I said. "Is someone at the door?" Georgie just stared at me blankly. "Georgie," I said more clearly this time. "Did someone knock on the door?" "No more knocking," he repeated. "Knocking on window. Knocking on window." I stood up, now wide awake. "Georgie, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a prank, I thought, but being alone in a house that big makes you a little jumpy. My mind started to race through the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy, in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees, and there were no homes within a quarter-mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic, and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably my friends, I thought, but what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told Georgie. Hand trembling slightly, I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Kate's room. Kate. I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still my heart thumped in my chest. This is silly, I told myself. Be a man. I made my way down the hall to Georgie's room and stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. If this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from Star Wars Battlefront's game-paused screen. I listened for a moment, but heard nothing. I began to suspect that Georgie had simply imagined the knocking. Somewhat exasperatedly, I moved to the window and flicked up a blind to reveal. Nothing. Just a landscape of freshly fallen snow backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night, relieved, as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes trailing an individual fractal all the way to the footprints just beneath the window's frame. Story 8. When I was a kid, well, a young teenager, I frequently spent my Saturday nights babysitting my siblings. As the eldest of 3, I assumed this responsibility with no pay nor thanks to speak of. It was simply expected of me, one of my contributions to the family. I babysat so frequently because, well, my parents needed it. They'd had marriage problems in the past, and their counselor told them they should go on a weekly date. Revive the magic, rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. Yeah, it sucked to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents were happier than they'd been in ages, and they both seemed genuinely excited for date night each week. I would have rather been doing other things, of course, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I desperately wanted my parents to stick together. And so it was that on the night of December 3rd, in the year 2006, I stood at the open front door of my secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway. "Drive safe," I called out, steam pouring from my mouth. I don't know if they heard me or not. Wrapping my arms around my torso in response to the wintry mountain air, I entertained myself for a few brief moments by exhaling forcefully and watching my breath float away into nothing. And there was truly nothing around me, not a car or a creature in sight. It wasn't long before I grew bored and turned back into the warm house, nose tingling from the chill. Georgie and Kate were eating their dinner at the kitchen table. As I watched them, I couldn't help feeling like an only child. Georgie, 3 years my junior, was severely autistic and not talkative. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and only then in the simplest of words. Milk and sandwich was code for peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was presently devouring. Kate, meanwhile, was still a baby just shy of 2. The 9-year gap between them is glaring, but to this day, my parents swear to me Kate wasn't an accident. Kind of like back in high school, when I swore to them I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished dinner, and I set them up with their entertainment for the night. Georgie in his room with the PlayStation 2, which was a hot commodity in those days, and Kate in her crib, in front of Sesame Street. Myself, I ignited the basement fireplace, dimmed the overheads, and curled up with a book by the light of our Christmas tree. God, that was a nice house. Not a day goes by that I don't miss it. I read, in perfect contentment, for nearly an hour. Night had fallen by then, and the room had become toasty. I was beginning to doze off when I heard Georgie's heavy footfalls descending the staircase. I sat upright and looked at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, brow furrowed in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I said. "Is someone at the door?" Georgie just stared at me blankly. "Georgie," I said more clearly this time. "Did someone knock on the door?" "No more knocking," he repeated. "Knocking on window. Knocking on window." I stood up, now wide awake. "Georgie, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a prank, I thought, but being alone in a house that big makes you a little jumpy. My mind started to race through the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy, in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees, and there were no homes within a quarter-mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic, and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably my friends, I thought, but what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told Georgie. Hand trembling slightly, I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Kate's room. Kate. I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still my heart thumped in my chest. This is silly, I told myself. Be a man. I made my way down the hall to Georgie's room and stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. If this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from Star Wars Battlefront's game-paused screen. I listened for a moment, but heard nothing. I began to suspect that Georgie had simply imagined the knocking. Somewhat exasperatedly, I moved to the window and flicked up a blind to reveal. Nothing. Just a landscape of freshly fallen snow backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night, relieved, as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes trailing an individual fractal all the way to the footprints just beneath the window's frame. At first I did not comprehend them. I just stared transfixed at the deep imprints in the snow. Shoes. A man's shoes. None of my friends wore the size, of that I felt sure. I traced them backwards from the window to the sidewalk, from whence this intruder had evidently come. But where did they lead? It was a bright night. The moon shone proudly between the clouds. My eyes followed the steps across the front yard, but once they passed behind the giant pine, they disappeared. My heart leapt to my throat. Whoever had walked behind that tree was still there. In panic, I quickly backed away from the window. Georgie, sensing my fear, began to whimper. "No, no, no, shhhhh," I muttered, desperate to keep him quiet. I flicked the television off and led Georgie out of the room. I quickly pulled Kate from her crib, powered her TV down as well, and carried her down the stairs in the blackness. "Can't see," Georgie said, and Kate began to cry. I shushed her hurriedly as we descended. Once in the basement den, I unplugged the Christmas tree, so that the only light in the room came from the embers of the dying fire. I sat Georgie down on the couch and settled Kate in his arms. "Sit right here," I directed, staring into his eyes. "Don't move, do you understand? Do not move. I need to call the police." I would have called my parents, but this was 10 years ago, and they didn't have cell phones. So I took the stairs quickly and quietly, tiptoeing to the phone hanging from the wall of our living room. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, but I heard nothing. Silence. I slammed it on the receiver and picked it up again. Again. Nothing. I think it was around this point that I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I was scared. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that the storm had killed the phone line. But there wasn't much of a storm. The snow was steady, sure, but there wasn't even a breeze. Certainly nothing that could have disabled our phone. Tentatively, I walked into Kate's room and peeked out the window. My first glance was toward the tree, of course, where the footprints stopped, but now they continued. Sometime while I was herding my siblings downstairs, whoever was behind the tree had moved. I followed the footsteps across my frozen front yard to a man, standing near the driveway. He was looking right at me. My breath stopped. I was frozen in place. This was not one of my friends. I had never seen this man before, but he was looking at me with an eerie blankness. He was wearing a black turtleneck and black slacks, a lone dark spot on a blanket of purest white. My eyes never left him, and his never left me. We stood still, silently staring, for what seemed like an eternity. My heart thrummed in my chest, and I felt nauseous. For the first time, gazing into this man's eyes from afar, I began to consider the possibility of my death. I thought of my dad's brother, who was killed in an accident at age 11. Forever 11. Never growing up. Frozen in time, in the memories of all who knew him, as a soul of eternal youth. At this, the tears flowed freely once more. "Please don't hurt us," I begged in a sobbing whisper. I knew he could not hear me, but I could not help myself. Finally, he broke eye contact with me and looked toward the heavens, toward the gently falling snow. He was saying something, but what, I could not hear. I stared, transfixed, as he pulled a handful of dark powder from his pocket. Then, still gazing upward, still muttering to himself, he flung the stuff at his feet. I desperately wanted to run, to get my siblings, but I thought that to let this man out of my sight would be unconscionably foolish. No, better to keep an eye on him. The house was still locked. I had the upper hand, I felt. Besides, I could not bring myself to look away from the strange ritual unfolding before me. The man had removed his sweater and flung it carelessly to the ground behind him. He was no longer staring skyward, but his lips continued to move. I trained my eyes intently upon his mouth, trying with no success to read his words, when I saw something glint in the moonlight. It was a knife, a long, callous blade, which he had removed from his other pocket. It bore dark stains already. From what? I covered my mouth to hush a scream as the man, still muttering to himself, ran the edge of the blade along his pale, distended stomach. A thin red line appeared along his abdomen, and blood of the deepest shade began to dribble from the wound. The streams trickled down his belly and fell ungracefully upon the black powder at his feet. At this, the man stared skyward once more, face contorted in a gruesome smile. He was sobbing uncontrollably, and mucus ran freely from his nostrils, but he looked happy. Beyond happy, elated. My stomach churned in revulsion. This man was in ecstasy. I watched, almost entranced by this bizarre unfolding, when the man's face changed suddenly. He looked directly at me once more, and his eyes appeared unhinged. Still clutching the knife, he began to sprint directly at my window. I took one look at the weapon this man brandished, and instinctively fled the room. I slammed the door shut behind me, and was halfway down the stairs when I heard the window shatter. The man screamed loudly in pain as I reached the basement. I locked the door behind me and ran to Georgie and Kate. "No more screaming," Georgie pleaded. "No, no more screaming," I agreed in hushed tones, stroking his hair in an effort to calm him down. Kate, meanwhile, seemed happy as a clam. I strained, listening intently. "Is he inside the house?" I still clung to some naive hope that he had injured himself on the glass and had retreated, or perhaps he had been weakened by his self-inflicted wound. Finally, I heard it, the subtle but unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. He was indeed inside the house, and by the sound of it, was trying to be quiet. I silently guided Georgie and Kate into a storage closet and closed the door behind us, manipulating the handle to make as little noise as possible. We stayed there for about 5 minutes, listening to the ceiling creak threateningly above us. Then I realized, I don't know why it took me so long, that we were not trapped. We still had a way out. I saw in my mind's eye a window well, in the bathroom down the hall, the only access our basement had to the outside world. Almost as if on cue, a frustrated scream echoed from above, followed by a tremendous crash. He had pulled something to the ground, perhaps the entertainment stand, or maybe the hutch. "He's here," the man shrieked hysterically. "How dare you hide from him?" To this day, I don't know who he was talking about, but it was at that moment, the moment I heard him begin to descend the stairs, that I made my move. Holding Kate in one arm and guiding Georgie with the other, we began our flight down the hallway. As we reached the bathroom, I stared fixedly at the window near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but we could make it. I flung the window open, stood on the toilet, and placed Kate gently in the shallow window well. Then I stepped off and told Georgie to get on. "Yucky gross, no standing on toilet," he said, looking embarrassed. I heard the man fumble with the locked handle at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I'm not proud of what I did next, but it was the only way I could think of to get Georgie to cooperate. I smacked my brother roughly across the face and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands. "Georgie, get on the fucking toilet." I snarled at him, the first time I had ever said that word. He began to wail in pain and surprise, but he did step onto the toilet all the same. "Climb out the window," I directed in a harsh tone, and as he grabbed the ledge, I used all the strength I could muster to help push him up. Once he almost slipped back down, almost, but he was stronger than I thought he was and managed to pull himself back up. With both of my siblings safely in the window well, I climbed on the toilet one last time and gripped the edge of the windowsill. As I clambered out myself, I heard a raucous crash. The man had broken down the basement door. With one last hoist, I pulled my legs up through the window and shut it quietly behind me. As I helped my siblings out of the well, I heard one last anguished shout from the man, muffled through the pane of glass. "Why are you hiding from him?" "Cold," screamed Georgie as I led him, barefoot, through the snowy grass. In panic, I shushed him, but it was no use. He and Kate were both crying quite loudly by this point. My only hope was to get them as far away from the house as possible. I heard a distant crash from inside the house, and I quickened our pace. Feet numb, I sprinted through the yard to the sidewalk, and practically had to drag Georgie onto it. "Bathroom light on," he said pleadingly. He was obsessive about turning off lights and electronics before leaving, and he was correct. We had left the bathroom light on in our haste. I ignored him and rushed us down the frozen pavement, stepping on sharp rocks and sticks, and not even comprehending it. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't know what we were headed toward. All I knew is what we were headed away from. The snow was falling much harder by this point. I could already see it collecting in a pile on Kate's head. Her nose was beet red and dripping with snot. I needed to get her inside. But where? I looked ahead and saw a light, off in the distance. The Garland's house. I'd said maybe a grand total of 6 words to Mr. and Mrs. Garland my entire life. But that was our one option. It was in their house that we would seek refuge. My house was now around the corner and out of sight, but I did not let up the pace until Georgie tripped on something and landed in a dark puddle. "Hey!" he screamed indignantly, looking back at his stumbling block. In the glow of the distant street light, I could see Georgie had fallen into blood. A dead man lay, face up and eyes open, on the sidewalk. Snow had fallen onto most of him, and he had been mostly invisible until Georgie's feet had connected with his midsection. I remembered the dark stain I had seen on our intruder's knife. "Come on," I pled, wrenching my eyes away from the grisly scene as I pulled Georgie to his feet. We ran for another 60 seconds, maybe, and finally reached the Garland's front door. The window into their parlor was open, and a fire was roaring. Mr. and Mrs. Garland sat, drinking tea, in cozy armchairs. I pounded ferociously on their door. They answered together, utter bewilderment stamped on their faces. I handed Kate to Mrs. Garland and collapsed into tears. The police arrived at my home 15 minutes later and apprehended the man, unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of our basement bathroom. They discovered him with a fractured skull, many deep lacerations from the window of Kate's room, and intestines partially protruding from the wound on his gut. He had slipped in his attempt to climb where we had climbed, hit his head, and knocked himself out. Apparently, he confessed under questioning that he was a member of a strange cult, a cult which, as far as anyone can tell, does not even exist. He claimed to have been taking part in a ritual which required the sacrifice of a pure soul, and my autistic brother had been his target that night. My parents have not shared with me all the details of what happened after that night, but as far as I know, our intruder is currently rotting in a cell. The man he killed, the man lying on the sidewalk, was a friend of my father who lived 2 streets over. He had called his wife on his cell phone not long before he died, informing her of a suspicious man dressed in black, stalking around the neighborhood. My parents arrived home from their date to find police swarmed around the block and their home a crime scene. My father relocated at work, and we had moved across the Rockies to Salt Lake City just 2 weeks later. Kate is now a bratty middle schooler. As far as I'm concerned, she's perfect. Georgie, now 21, hasn't changed a bit, but he loses his mind if someone knocks on a window. As for me, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie now. I climb mountains with narrow trails and steep ridges. I go cave diving in places where you shouldn't. All, I think, in an attempt to recreate the fearful intensity of that one snowy night long ago. But it never works. The closest I come is when I'm alone, in my room, in the dead of night. Then, and then alone, is when the real fear sets in.